In this lesson, we'll learn about the interaction between a client, its DNS server, and domain controllers for the client to locate its domain controller. First, we will learn how a DC maps IP addresses to site names. Then we learn about the DC locator process for a new PC. After that, we will learn about the DC locator process for a PC moved to a new site. And finally, we sum up our lesson with the keynotes. To map IP addresses to site names, the netlock-on service on each domain controller reads the configuration container, which allows it to get all the sites in the AD forest and their associated subnet objects. The netlock-on service then enumerates the site objects in the configuration container. It also can get notified of any changes made to the site objects. The netlock-on service finally uses the site information to build an in-memory structure that is used to map IP addresses to site names. As you may know, when a new PC logs on for the first time, it does not have information of which site it belongs to. To get started, it searches for a domain controller from its DNS servers. The DNS server returns a list of IP addresses of all domain controllers in the domain. Upon receiving the list of IP addresses from the DNS server, the PC queries all domain controllers in the list. For each DC being queried, the Active Directory on the DC intercepts the query to get the client IP address and passes it to the DC's netlock-on service. The netlock-on service looks up the client IP address in its subnet to site mapping table by finding the subnet objects that most closely matches the client IP address and then returns the following information: the name of the site in which the client is located, or the site that most closely matches the client IP address, the name of the site in which the current domain controller is located, a bit that indicates whether the file domain controller is located or not located in the site closest to the client. The client inspects the message returned from the domain controller to determine whether to try to find a better domain controller. If the return domain controller is in the closest site, the client uses that domain controller. If the client has already tried to find a domain controller in the site in which the domain controller claims the client is located, the client uses that domain controller. Now let's take a look at this diagram. As you can see, this is a message returned from LHPVDC03. It informs the client that the client is in Chicago site and it is in Elgin site, and CPVDC11 is in the client site. So in this case, the client just dropped the message because it had already tried to find CPVDC11. Similarly, this is a message from LHPVDC02 from the same Elgin site. So the client just dropped the message. And here is the message returned from OPVDC01. It tells the client that the client is in Chicago site and it is in Aurora site, and CPVDC11 is in the client side. So in this case, the clients also drop the message and waiting for the response from CPVDC11. Finally, the client receives the message from SHIP-PVDC11. It informs the client that the client is in Chicago site and it is also in Chicago site, and it is a domain controller in the client side. So in this case, SHIP-PVDC11 is in the closest site, so the client uses SHIP-PVDC11. If the domain that is being queried by a computer is the same as the domain to which the computer is joined, the site in which the computer resides as reported by a domain controller is stored in the computer registries. The computer stores this site name in the dynamic site name registry entry in HKey local machine system current control set services netlog on parameters. Therefore, the ds-get-sitename API returns the site in which the computer is located. So in this case, the PC is joined to the domain hq.itlifeskills.local, and the domain that the PC query is also hq.itlifeskills.local. So it stores the size Chicago in the dynamic size name registry entry. The client is now moved to a different site. However, it still uses its original site information and contacts the DC in the original site. The Active Directory on the DC intercepts the query, which contains the IP address of the client, and passes the IP address to its netlog-on service. The netlog-on looks up the client IP address in its subnet to size mapping table by finding the subnet object that most closely matches the client IP address. The DC then returns the site information to the client, and here is the message. It informs the client that the client size is now engined and the DC size is Chicago, and LHPVDC02 and LHPVDC03 are the domain controllers in the client size. If the domain controller is not in the closest site, the client updates its site information. The client then sends a new DNS query to find a new domain controller in the site. So in this case, the client updates its site as engines. As soon as the client receives the list of IP addresses from the DNS server, the client contacts all domain controllers in the list and waiting for a response from a domain controller. If the client receives a response from a domain controller in the site, it uses the new domain controller. If not, the client uses the original domain controller. In this case, the client receives both responses from the two domain controllers in the engine side. However, it chooses to use LHPVDC02 because LHPVDC02 responds back to the client first. You can override the dynamic sign-in value using the registries, but you should never change dynamically determined values. To override the dynamic sign-in, add the sign-in entry with the fixed-length text string data type in HKey local machine system current control set services netlog on parameters. When a value is present in the sign-in entry, the dynamic sign-in entry is not used. Let's now verify the dynamic sign-in value in the registries of Win10 PC01. First, we need to Verify that we are on Win10 PC01 by typing the command ipconfigure space /or and hit enter. As you can see, we are on Win10 PC01 and it has the IP address 10.20.1.100. Let's open the registry editor by typing the command regedit and hit enter. As you can see, we are at HKey local machine system current control set services net log on parameters. And let's open the dynamic sign name. And here it is. As you can see, it has the value algins. This is the end of this lesson. Let's read the keynotes for the domain controller locator process.